everybody. Welcome to Bold TV. I'm Carrie Sheffield, the founder of Bold TV, and I am thrilled for my guest here today, J.C. Watts. He's the chairman of the Black News Channel. Welcome, J.C.
Thank you, Carrie. We're hearing good things about Bold and what you're doing here, and we're tickled to be in New York and to be with you today.
Well, we're tickled that you're here, and we have heard inquiring minds want to know, what is Black News Channel?
Well, good question. It's an African American news channel that is culturally specific to the African American community, and it is, for African Americans, by African Americans, and about African Americans. And I think people in my life's experiences of living for 61 years, I think over the last, for much of my time in public service, you've gotten one view or one perspective or one picture of the African American community, and it's so much more in the Black community than crime. There's obviously politics, there's economics, there's wellness, there's faith, there's culture. There's a whole host of things that exist in the Black community, and we want to be the venue, the network that tells those stories.
And so what do you think is missing? Because you said that, there is this perception that, you mentioned crime. We just had the director of the iconic film Boys in the Hood just passed away. He was instrumental in many other films and giving rise to many prominent actors and producers and directors. What do you think is currently missing in the milieu of Black culture that is the niche that you're planning to fill?
Well, and I think Mr. Singleton, the producer of Boys in the Hood, I saw that movie and was introduced to Ice Cube and introduced to Cuba Gooding Jr. and what they did. And if you recall, even in that movie, there was Lawrence Fishburne was the father of Cuba Gooding. And although he was a single father, he was trying to raise his son the right way, and he saw the outside influences, and he was a father that took the stand and took a stand against things that would influence his son the wrong way, and that side of the African American community, that's not told. For every Black kid or white kid or red, yellow, or brown kid for that matter that's out doing something bad at night and not being a good role model or a good citizen, I can show you 100 Black kids that get up every morning trying to make their mom proud and trying to make their dad proud. And so I think obviously there's things that, news is news, but news is more than sports, and I participated in sports for 25, 30 years. I've got kids that participate in sports, but there's more to the African American community than sports and entertainment. There's wellness. You don't hear Fox News or MSNBC or CNN talking about sickle cell. My family, or many Black families, are impacted by sickle cell, and it's a blood disorder. And I'm involved in a 5K run, raising money, raising awareness about sickle cell on an annual basis. That's a disease that impacts about 95% of the people impacted by sickle cell. They're African Americans. Mm-hmm. So you don't hear networks talking about that. So we will be talking about things that other networks aren't talking about. And like I said, it's culturally specific to the African American community. So if you're talking about Thanksgiving dinner on the Black News Channel, you're not going to be talking about pumpkin pie for dessert. You're going to be talking about sweet potato pie for dessert. Doesn't mean that Black people don't eat pumpkin pie, but culturally, we are more inclined to have, sweet potato pie and cornbread dressing for Thanksgiving as opposed to having, pumpkin pie and stuffing. So
I'll take all of the above. You're making me hungry. But what about the current Black press that's already out there? A Black Enterprise, BET, The Root. There is and even startups that are serving, millennial African Americans. What makes the Black News Channel different from the Black press that's currently there?
Well, when you look at TV One, Kathy Hughes has been her and her son, they've been heroes. They are heroes of mine. You know, BET and what Bob Johnson started years ago. I mean, to see the challenge that we've had over the last 10, 12 years in trying to get to the point that we can get distribution, we can line up investments, and you know, we're going to launch in November of this year, November of 2019. And I think, you know, when you look at BET and TV1, they're more on the entertainment side. We're more on the news side. We want to, you know, our mission, we say that we want to inspire and inform and educate. And so, not that you can't educate with some show, as I mentioned, Boys in the Hood. I mean, there were some good educational moments in that movie. But what we're trying to accomplish, we will be a 24/7 news program that informs and educates and inspires the African American community. And so the news format that we have makes us different. There's no, out of the 373 channels that you can get on cable, you don't have a channel on television today in the lineup that is news for, by, and about the African American community.
Mm-hmm. So, but you mentioned news and sort of the different perception or depiction of African Americans. You mentioned, you know, the kids who are waking up and doing good and you know, staying out of trouble. But when it comes to news, how does that equation work for you guys? Because there's a phrase in the news business that says, if it bleeds, it leads.
Well,
so what's the thinking editorially?
Well, you know, when I took a trip, I led a delegation to Africa back in the late 90s when I was in Congress with some of my colleagues. And we were in West Africa, and I understand history will tell you that about 80% of the slave trade was in West Africa. And we went to Senegal, Nigeria, Ghana, Mali, some of the West African countries. And we saw poverty, obviously, but we saw hospitals being built, we saw health clinics, we saw school teachers, we saw kids in school, we saw, you know, families sowing and harvesting gardens. We saw a whole host of things. And a buddy of mine from Louisiana that went with me, he went home and talked to his 90-year-old granddad and told his granddad what he had seen. He said, Granddad, I was over in Africa, and he said, we saw hospitals being built, we saw teachers, we saw kids in schools, we saw health clinics, we saw entrepreneurs. He told him all the things he had seen, and his granddad said, I knew there was more. Mm. Well, news is not just leading by bleeding. Obviously, that's important. If something happens in the community, we want to talk about that. But we want to tell a more comprehensive story. You know, there's wellness news, there's obviously political news, there's economic news, there's news from the faith community, historical black colleges and universities. I mean, there's a wealth of news and information just in the HBCU community alone. You could almost create enough content to provide what you needed on a daily basis. And
well,
so,
I think Beyonce would agree with that.
But
and in that vein, HBCUs, you've got a relationship with Black News Channel. Walk us through that.
Well, you know, HBCUs will be in Tallahassee, Florida, and Tallahassee, Florida has Florida A&M University, FAMU, and FAMU has a great journalism school. Howard University has a great journalism school. We will have.
You'll be housed on campus.
No, when we originally started, that was 4 or 5 years ago. That was a plan, but we've evolved out of that now. But we will have a curriculum that we will train, have internships, and have training programs for black journalists, and also there's black journalists that you don't hear a whole lot about. When you see a black journalist on TV, they're usually being interviewed by other journalists, and they're not talking about African American news necessarily. They're not talking about sickle cell, or they're not talking about how this impacts the black community. So again, we will be internship programs, training programs, training, if you will, the next generation of African American journalists. But we're interested in stories and news that is culturally specific to our demographic.
Mm-hmm. And it's no secret politically that you were a Republican congressman, that you're conservative. I'm sure a lot of people are going to be asking, how would your politics influence this project?
Well, Carrie, we all bring biases, if you will, to the table when it comes to issues of the day: taxes, education, foreign policy, defense policy, healthcare policy. But conservative, I like to define my conservatism like this: conservative is living the way your grandmama taught you to live. And you and I can do this show, and we can adamantly disagree with each other. But I think that what's missing in the debate, what's missing in the discussion, if that's what you want to call it, I think is a decency, a respect for each other. I disagree with myself. That's why I changed my mind. I mean,
we've all been there.
So I think the important thing is, your grandmother would want you to treat other people the way you want to be treated. Your grandmother would say, hey, look, don't waste. That generation, that World War II generation, my grandparents, my parents, I don't care if you were growing up in an affluent neighborhood or a poor neighborhood. The poor neighborhoods, we didn't waste a lot. We maximized whatever food we had, and you're coming up with all these different ways to cook it and to fry it and to dye it, and to do all you had to do to survive. And I'm grateful for that upbringing. I couldn't have told you when I was a senior in college if I was a liberal or conservative, but again, if you live by the principles of Scripture and the way your parents and your grandparents taught you to live, again, I've never abandoned that. I can disagree with you, but you're a human being, and I should respect your perspective, even if it's different than mine. And so we're not looking to be Republican or Democrat, but we do want to have a healthy discussion, a healthy debate about the issues of the day in that current affairs space. But again, we will remind our audience, as we have with our advertisers, with our distribution partners, with our advertising partners, we're a whole lot more than politics. We are economics, we are wellness, we are faith, we are culture. And so we think that sets us apart from most folks, if not all, that's out there.
So I guess, will it make it different that you are a conservative that is running this, and by that frame of reference, that's the product differentiator?
Right. I don't think so. Our news and programming director, I've not talked to him about his political affiliation, how he's registered. I was more concerned about his 40-plus years of experience in the news business. Gary Wardlaw, we hired him. He came on February 1st of this year full-time with us. We hired him out of the Nexstar family. But Gary understands news, he understands programming, he understands the demographic that the Black News Channel is targeting, and I think it's more about him, and it's more about the type of content that we're looking for that really matters. And again, I don't think we can avoid, if you come on and you're a conservative and someone else comes on and they're liberal or moderate or progressive, we want that discussion to be had. We feel like our audience, the African American audience, is no different than any other audience. you set the table, you put the menu out there, and you talk about what's on the menu, and people can make their own decisions. I would rarely I don't envision us saying we want to have a conservative and nobody else to counter or to argue the rest of the story or the other side of the story.
Well, that's certainly not reflective of the African American community or even the country.
And the same thing on the liberal side. And you're right, it's not. You can look at the numbers from Nielsen every month and see, who watches MSNBC or CNN or Fox News, and it's pretty much gotten to the point that conservatives will watch Fox News, and left-leaning people will watch CNN and MSNBC. And my only advice to those people that do that, I'd say, for every 25, 30 minutes you watch Fox News or MSNBC or CNN, turn over to Little House on the Prairie and kind of bring yourself back into balance.
Yeah. Enter the real world.
Bring yourself back into balance.
So I have a business question, because you mentioned you're going to be syndicated on cable. And we've seen overall, especially my generation, the millennial generation, we're cutting the cord. We are leaving traditional cable. We're going more for OTT. We're going for Roku. We're going for Amazon Fire. We're not in cable so much. So what's the business strategy from a distribution standpoint as it relates to traditional cable versus these other platforms?
That's a great question. We do have an OTT strategy. We are, here about a year ago, the first two advertisers I visited with Ford and Walmart about advertising with us, and almost right out of the box, the first strategy is what's your digital strategy? What's your OTT strategy? Well, we've had discussions with many of those people who are on OTT. We are very conscious of the millennial crowd. We've got one of the guys that's a part of our group is Amir Wyndham, who is an award-winning creative producer that's working with us to give us the right kind of flavor for the millennial crowd, for those who are saying we're cutting the cord. But what we also found out with the millennial generation, they will often use their phone to gather data, but go to the linear channels to confirm it. And so it's not, it's very difficult today to survive without having a DishNet or a Comcast or a Charter or a DirecTV. If you're trying to launch, and I know people that's tried to launch in the last 4 or 5 years, that they didn't survive just trying to operate with the streaming service or digitally. So the linear and the digital, just like AT&T, they've got an OTT service. DishNet, they've got an OTT service. Everybody out there that has a linear platform, they also have a digital strategy. So we'll have both, just like everybody else.
Sure, that makes sense. It is diversification, the key to business. So I'm curious, so you were a professional athlete in the NFL, and then you were in Congress. What got you into this? How did you get into this realm? What sparked the idea for you?
Well, I did. I was in politics. I played in the Canadian Football League for 5 years, drafted by the New York Jets, but chose to go to Canada instead because I could play quarterback. Mm-hmm. And back in the mid to late 70s, when I was playing at the University of Oklahoma, Kerry, you didn't have black quarterbacks. You didn't have quarterbacks that looked like me. And so I think how we've evolved in the NFL and in the National Basketball Association, you see more black coaches today, black coordinators in football, offensive and defensive coordinators. You see black quarterbacks. As a matter of fact, University of Oklahoma, Kyler Murray, African American, was just the first player taken, quarterback, in the latest NFL draft. But the thing that got me interested in this, I'm a journalism major. My degree is in journalism from the University of Oklahoma, 1981. And I saw a study in about 1996 or 7, and it had the top 10 TV programs. And back when I was growing up, when I was a kid, you had 3 networks, ABC, NBC, and CBS. We all got our information the same way. And in spite of the fact that you might have had Jim Crow, or you might have had segregation, or you might have had barriers, because I remember when I couldn't swim in the public swimming pool. I had to sit in the balcony of the movie theater. I couldn't sit down below with my white friends. I didn't see black quarterbacks unless I was watching the Southwestern Athletic Conference, Grambling, Jackson State, Alcorn, those schools like that, Langston, Oklahoma, in my home state. But I saw a survey in about 1996 or 7, and had the top 10 TV shows, the top 10 in the black community, top 10 in the white community, and none of them overlapped. Steve Harvey was number 1 in the black community. ER was number 1 in the white community, but ER did make the top 10 list in the black community, but it was last. And the reason it made the black community's list is because they had an actor on there by the name of Denzel Washington, somebody that they felt, I guess the community felt like we could relate to. So I started to peel that onion and started to figure out, start asking questions about why is this? And so when you look at the lineup of channels these days on TV, you've got a channel that can speak to, the white community, or women, or Hispanics, or African Americans. There is a channel almost for every flavor out there. It's kind of like Baskin Robbins. But I think at the end of the day, we all, like to see somebody that looks like us. My daughter, our youngest daughter, she was with me on the floor of the house. She was 7 at the time. In the swearing-in ceremonies, if your kids were under 12, they could go on the floor of the house with you. She was on the floor of the house with me. She was 7 years old. And I was introducing her to some members of Congress, and they were all male. And this little 7-year-old mind, she said to me, she said, "Daddy, do you have women congressmen?" 7 years old. Mm-hmm. I think we all need to have somebody that gives us a picture of what it's supposed to look like. And so, again, the Black News Channel, we want to give African Americans a picture, a truer picture of ourselves. Again, I go back to, we're more than politics. We're more than athletes. We're more than sports figures or entertainers, and nothing wrong with that, because I participated in the sports arena for 25 plus years. But again, there's more, and I think my kids, and this is the thing that I think conservatives miss, that Republicans miss, the people that they hold out trying to speak to the black community, they run them away. I think I never saw men in my neighborhood going to work in coat and ties, but I saw them going to work. I've been fortunate that most of my adult life, I've gone to work every day in a coat and tie. But those men in my neighborhood, they were providers for their family. They made the house. They bought their houses. They didn't rent. They owned their homes. They bought school clothes for the kids and put food on the table, and that still happens today. But you don't see that part of the African American community, and we won't just. I mean, it won't be about that every day.
Sure.
But that needs to be in the mix.
So when you mentioned that conservatives and who they put forward to speak to the black community, you said that they drive them away. Another argument that I hear from a lot of conservatives is the Barry Goldwater argument. So he opposed the Civil Rights Act and this very libertarian strain within the Republican Party to say that this type of outreach, I see it as a female conservative. I'm criticized when I say we need to reach out to women. They say that's pandering and that's identity politics and that's sexist. And why are you doing this? And I say to them, well, this is really about winning. I want to win. And we lost the House, for example, last year because of many Republican women who lost their seats. So to me, it's really about policy and winning. But what do you say to that, to this argument about from conservatives that we should really be colorblind, that this is some form of affirmative action project that you're doing, that it's something that is in some ways just driving a cultural wedge even further between black and white Americans?
Well, when someone says to me, we should be colorblind, Carrie, that argument has no bearing or no validity or no credibility with me. God made us who we are. When you ignore my color or I ignore your gender, I'm doing a real I'm executing a real injustice. There are differences. I mean, we can all agree on personal responsibility, hard work, sacrifice, all those things that Republicans talk about or that they used to talk about. We can agree on those things, but there's some experiences that I had as an African American that you wouldn't have had. There's some experiences as a woman that you've had that I wouldn't have had. And by the way, I probably couldn't relate to the experiences that you have experienced as a woman, but I tell you what, I know right and wrong. And I can say what you did to Carrie was wrong. I don't necessarily know your motive. I can't open people's heart and judge their hearts to say your motive was this, but I can judge right and wrong and say the way you treated her was wrong. And so I just think it's crazy that Republicans would say, let's ignore who God made us, the way He made us. You had no say in your gender. I had no say in my skin color. And when people say, well, you know, we don't practice identity politics, when you ignore the female vote, that's identity politics. You can practice identity politics by ignoring people. And when you say that we have no interest in reaching out to the black community, that's identity politics because you're ignoring a demographic. My thing is this. If you come to my church on Sunday mornings, before we ever preach a sermon, before we ever do anything, we speak to people. Because our music ministry, you've got white, you've got black, you've got Hispanic. And so we preach a sermon before we ever say a word because of just what our music team looks like. And so, yeah, I think you can practice identity politics by ignoring people. And people might have disagreed with me when I was in politics, but I understood the HBCU community. We have one in Langston, and Vernon Jordan said once, he said in his book, Vernon Can Read, he said, if we didn't have the HBCU communities, he said he was talking about how valuable they've been in the nation, and especially to the black community. He said, if we didn't have HBCUs today, we would have to create them. I know the value of the HBCU community. I know the value of wellness and sickle cell and fighting that on a daily basis. I know the value of being inclusive to say, you know, Carrie, we have to be intentional in saying, and I get this from my faith, not from my politics, to say, I'm going to be intentional in reaching out and giving her a chance, giving her an opportunity. And you know why I got that? My heart's like that? Because it happened to me. I've had people that drove across the railroad tracks and they said, we want to hire 2 black kids this summer. Do you know any? And I said, I'm one of them. I'll go find one of my buddies. One of the best summer jobs I ever had when I was in high school. So I think identity politics, again, I just repeat, you can practice identity politics by ignoring the female vote,
No,
by ignoring the Hispanic vote.
Very interesting point. You mentioned the HBCUs, and I know that the Trump administration has been a big supporter of increasing funding for HBCUs. As a Black Republican, we have to talk about Trump because it's obviously a big factor in the Republican Party right now. And we are seeing, especially among Black men, the quote-unquote Kanye effect, that there is, he outperformed Mitt Romney, he outperformed John McCain within the Black community. President Trump did. What's your take on the Trump administration, and how will the Black News Channel approach it?
Well, it's news, so I think you have to be in the mix. You don't ignore any president, Republican, Democrat, how civilized you think they are, how uncivilized you think they might be. I think, one of the things that I think the Republican Party or President Trump has to understand, I mean, he wasted 18 months with someone, had someone in the White House supposedly reaching out to the Black community, and he ended up, terminating that person, and 18 months of outreach had been squandered because there was no outreach. When you look at this administration, for the first time in over 50 years, Carrie, there's not been an African American sitting at the principal's table, if you will. Someone that's been a strategist, someone that's been engaged in grassroots politics, someone that understands how to connect the dots, and because I've had people call me and say, hey, we're going down to Atlanta, who should we see down there? We're going into Los Angeles, who should we see there? We're going into wherever, who should we see? So I think that's hurt the administration, not that, with this president that he would have listened, but at least you would have had someone there.
Mm-hmm. And what about Ben Carson?
Well, like I said, Dr. Carson has never been a strategist. He's never been a grassroots, official, and I say that respectfully to Dr. Carson. But someone that's a Valerie Jarrett type on the Democrat side under President Obama.
What if Trump called you? Would you say yes?
Carrie, I've got more
you're
than
busy.
I can say grace over, and I do think, when you give the impression that you don't care, I do think there's been some bizarre messages that I think the Black community has received from this administration that I think it doesn't help when you say that, people in the Charlottesville, Virginia situation here, year and a half, almost 2 years ago, when you say that there's good people on both sides. Now, everybody will have their interpretation of what that means, but you know what my conservative Republican ears heard? That you believe that people down there who are white supremacists or Nazis, they don't believe that my 3-year-old granddaughter should even be in the country because of her skin color. And so, words do matter. Sticks and stones may break my bones, but words will never hurt me. That's the biggest lie that's ever come down the pike with you, with me, with all of us. Words do matter. I used to hear all the time in politics, perception is reality. Well, it is.
Mm-hmm. And what about the response about the statue specifically, that this was about a piece of history and that there could be someone in good faith who thinks that the statue should remain, if only for historical purposes, to not forget the past, don't try to whitewash or pretend that the past didn't happen. We were talking about school names and the school that you went to.
And history is history. It is what it is. We can't erase it. But my thing is this, I would ask the question, you know, those statues were put up, and we can't say, well, Carrie, I don't like the shoes that you have on, so I'm offended by that. And we've kind of created an industry out of being offended, and I talked about that in my last book, Dig Deep, 7 Truths to Finding the Strength Within, that I released about 2 years ago, before we had a president, before we had a nominee for the Republican and Democrat Party, and I talked about this very thing, that we've created an industry out of being offended. But this is the thing. Statutes tell us a lot about who we are in a generation. And Robert E. Lee, Jefferson Davis, I mean, those were men in the South that you know, we beat them up for owning slaves and for being slave masters, etc. Well, it's interesting. You can't have slaves. You can't have slavery without slaves. No one's ever put up a statue of a slave to say they contributed to the welfare of this country. They helped build this country. If you see a statue of a slave, it's in the Birmingham Civil Rights African American Museum, which I would advise anybody to go down there and take a look at. You know, the Memphis African American Museum, there at Lorraine Hotel, where Reverend King was assassinated. So it's interesting. I think in the discussion we talk a lot about, you know, the slave masters, but we don't talk a whole lot about the slave themselves. So I would say, hey, I'm not going to fight you over the Robert E. Lee, you know, statue, that memorial, but also there's the rest of the story that is also history that we tend to ignore.
Mm-hmm. Right, and that's, as you mentioned, by ignoring things, that's making a statement.
That's right.
So.
That's making a statement.
Excellent. Well, I know we've delved into a lot of topics here, and I really appreciate it. Congressman, Chairman, what should I call you? Lots of titles.
JC always works.
JC, yeah. So you're launching in November, and what's the pitch? What to our audience here at Bold TV?
Well, we are launching in November of this year. We will be on. As of today, we will be. If we launch tomorrow, we would be in about 33 million households. DishNet, we've got carriage with them. We've got carriage with Charter, who has just been a great partner for us, and will be a great partner for us, and Comcast. And we think before it's all said and done, by January of 2019, we will launch in about 42, have carriage in about 42 to 45 million households. So we're going to get a great start. We think we've got a great product. We think we've got a great story to tell, and we're excited about the reception that we've gotten, and thank you very much for letting me come on and talk about it.
No, we appreciate it. We launched in November also, November 30th. So.
Okay.
Yep.
Okay.
November's
so
a great month.
Your anniversary, yeah.
Yeah, great. Well, thank you so much, JC, for joining us, and thank you all for tuning in here. Make sure to check out the Black News Channel. How do they find you?
BlackNewsChannel.com, and that tells you all about us and some of our programming concepts, and of course a lot of that will change. You know, before November, but it gives you a little bit of flavor, a little color on who we are and what we're doing. And we had our formal announcement about a month ago at the NAACP, the non-televised NAACP Image Awards dinner. And just, you know, we've been to the African American Mayors Association and got some good feedback there, and just the reception's been really, really good, and we think that this is going to be a transformational project, and think it will add a lot of value, not just to the African American community, but also I think to communities at large.
All right. Well, we will stay tuned. Thank you so much, JC Watts.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you all.